Late last week, the entire multi-year coronavirus saga effectively came to a whisper-quiet, anticlimactic end, at least as far as the CDC is concerned. But of course, as CDC concerns go, so too goes seemingly every other policy in the country, public or private. After 2+ years of wartime metaphors, frontline healthcare workers dug into the trenches, fighting an invisible viral enemy. So we all have to do our part at home by staying home, making personal sacrifices so the battle can be won. Despite treating this like World War III, we don't get the World War ending. There is no ticker tape parade. There is no sailor dipping and kissing a woman in Times Square. There is no great triumphant moment to tell you that all of that struggle was actually worth it for any sort of clear reason. Instead, it's just a shrug. Indeed, on Thursday, the CDC issued new relaxed corona guidelines, not because we've defeated the virus, so all the personal costs we've incurred were worthy sacrifice. No, we're relaxing now because the CDC says the virus is just here to stay. Though I guess in fairness, we may not have had the same post-war celebrations if the thing to celebrate was Hitler and Hirohito are here to stay. May not have had the same election result if the campaign promise was the virus is here to stay either. Recall, of course, back then, the promise was to shut it down, not learn to live with it. But more importantly, right up until this CDC announcement, this was forbidden reasoning anyway. If you had made this same suggestion that the virus is here to stay, and so maybe upending an entire world economy and restricting the rights of millions and driving people to despair isn't the best way to deal with what is a biological inevitability, you were a science denier. You were a conspiracy theorist. You were sentencing everyone's grandmas to viral executions all because you were irredeemably selfish. But now, just at the snap of an allegedly scientific finger, suddenly all of those things are completely fair points. Now, that's just a realistic understanding that you can't violate the rights of others as a means to control airborne viral spread. It's a morally wrong approach to a biological impossibility anyway. And so away goes social distancing, away goes quarantining if you've been exposed to the virus, but most insultingly, away go distinctions between vaccinated and unvaccinated people in general. The CDC says since most people are either vaccinated or have had prior infection, quote, it really makes the most sense to not differentiate. Well, that's funny because I seem to remember some forcible differentiation. I remember if you said the same thing within the last year, hey, maybe I don't need the vaccine since I had a prior infection, you were to be fired. And not just by your boss's discretion, but by the unconstitutional expansion of federal force to do it. And if you still stuck to your convictions, well, then you were an evil person to be publicly demonized as responsible for the pandemic and a winter of severe illness and death. Oh, but that was then. And this is now, and things are way different, are they? As justification for the policy change, the CDC is citing many Americans having some degree of protection. That's interesting that vaccination is now only described as some degree of protection, not the impenetrable wall of protection it was originally advertised as, but some degree of protection plus various treatments available in addition to the vaccines and boosters. Because of all that, individual responsibility is now the proper approach. All of those things were true before they started forcing mandates. All of the vaccines were readily available. All of the treatments were readily available. None of that science changed. Only the politics did. Indeed, in the New York Times piece on the new guidelines, infectious disease expert and former Biden corona advisor Michael Osterholm outright says it, quote, the CDC is attempting to meet up with the reality that everyone in the public is pretty much done with this pandemic. It is not a shift in science. It is a shift in public opinion that will burn them electorally if they do not adjust. It was a policy born in politics. Now it's a policy dying in politics. The policy lived its whole life in politics, and the explanations otherwise were lies the whole time. And of course, the effort to coerce you into what they now say matters little anyway, it wasn't just about your livelihood and your reputation. It wasn't just about ruining your life. It was about controlling what you could say about that too. Officially, we were supposed to believe that the march toward censorship was merely a suggestion from the White House, not any sort of formal action, but of course, the indications of efforts behind the scenes were always apparent. In fact, They weren't indications at all. They were outright saying they were doing it. Recall, one of the first things Jen Psaki ever circled back on was an effort to work with social media companies to reduce hate speech on their platforms. This was within the first 2 weeks of the new presidency.
We've certainly spoken to, and he's spoken to, the need for social media platforms to continue to take steps to reduce hate speech.
But that was just an opinion, not any actual effort. It's just what Biden would like these platforms to do, not what he's pushing them to do. That was the line. Though, of course, even that line of the president having public opinions about who he'd like to see censored is one that's fundamentally at odds with American constitutional values. It doesn't matter, though, because the line wasn't drawn there anyway. Within months, more clues were dropping from the Psaki podium. By July of last year, she was saying, yeah, we are actively flagging posts for Facebook that we think ought to be taken down.
In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken, or we're working to take, I should say, from the federal government, we're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation.
So this time, it wasn't just an opinion. Notably, this was described as a formal presidential action, and this time it wasn't just broad rule suggestions they were saying should apply equally to everyone either. At the same time, they released a specific list of 12 people they called the Disinformation Dozen. 12 specific individuals the White House wanted banned on social media, not just on some platforms, but according to Psaki, on all of them.
To create robust enforcement strategies that bridge their properties and provide transparency about rules. You shouldn't be banned from one platform and not others for providing misinformation out there.
And where did they get this list of the Disinformation Dozen? It came from an organization called the Center for Countering Digital Hate. What do wrong opinions about coronavirus and vaccines have to do with hate? Well, that's why it's so important to understand Psaki's original comments. When they say hate, they mean simply opinions with which they disagree. So even if you have honest questions about the vaccine, asked as politely as possible, that is still hateful. And of course, the fact checkers insisted that nothing you're seeing and hearing with your own eyes and ears is actually happening at all. It is misinformation to say that the White House and Jen Psaki are calling for social media censorship, and if they aren't calling for it, well, then they certainly aren't participating in it. Again, because it's all just suggestion, no action. The First Amendment doesn't apply to private companies like Facebook or Twitter, and so as long as they're making their own independent decisions, there are no constitutional or legal implications. Well, how independent are the decisions when the administration officials and the tech executives are all great friends? When one scratches the back of the other, that's not independence. That's a corrupt circumvention of the law, or at least the spirit of it. But it goes well beyond that. How independent are the decisions when one provably tells the other what to do? Because that proof has now emerged through a lawsuit from former New York Times and now independent journalist Alex Berenson, critical and skeptical of vaccines, but in particular vaccine mandates, and paying the social media price for it. In August of last year, Berenson tweeted, quote, "It doesn't stop infection or transmission. Don't think of it as a V word, Susan. I'm trying to be careful. Please put the axe down. Think of it at best as a therapeutic with a limited window of efficacy and terrible side effect profile that must be dosed in advance of illness. And we want to mandate it? Insanity." Twitter originally restricted the tweet and labeled it as misinformation, despite the CDC director saying almost the same thing only 2 weeks prior, at least the same thing with regard to transmission. But shortly thereafter, Berenson was banned outright. Berenson was not one of the White House's so-called Disinformation Dozen, but this banning did happen only about a month after Jen Psaki's press conferences identifying the White House's targets and discussing their flagging efforts on social media. And like the Disinformation Dozen, Berenson was personally targeted by the White House for social media censorship. Berenson filed a lawsuit against Twitter for what he said was a wrongful banning. He has recently emerged successful in that lawsuit, or at least it's been settled. His account has been reinstated, and the lawsuit revealed some factual fruits as well. As part of the evidence gathered, there are records from internal employee communications at Twitter that describe a staff meeting with White House officials in April of last year. One employee asks the other, "How was the White House?" The other employee responds, quote, "Overall pretty good. They had one really tough question about why Alex Berenson hasn't been kicked off the platform. Otherwise, their questions were pointed but fair, and mercifully, we had answers. Not to read too much into it, but note that sentence is saying the White House's questions were reasonable, except for about this one guy in particular. About this one guy in particular, they were personally very aggressive. So why the aggressive personal targeting of Berenson? Well, because, the employee says, Andy Slavitt, a senior advisor to the president's corona response team, said that their data shows Berenson is an epicenter of disinformation that radiates outward to the persuadable public. And the White House cannot lose control of the persuadable public. The worst possible scenario is one in which you are freely persuaded. That cannot happen. And so Berenson was banned. Now, to be completely precise, there is no line in the employee communications that says, hey, did you ban Berenson yet, as commanded by the White House? But it is documented that Twitter's position was that Berenson did not violate the terms. Said one high-level employee connected to this White House meeting at the time, quote, I've taken a pretty close look at his account, and I don't think any of it is violative. Really tough question why Alex Berenson hasn't been kicked off. Well, then it's not a tough question about why he was. This was not an independent Twitter decision. This was done by White House request. The White House found the man, and so Twitter had to find the crime. It is apparent that without White House meddling, this ban never happens at all. Because Twitter didn't think he should be banned then, and after the lawsuit, they don't think he should be banned now. Twitter publicly acknowledges with the lawsuit settlement, Berenson's tweet should not have led to his suspension at that time. And so you wonder, what other punitive White House actions should not have led to consequences at that time? Should thousands have been fired from their jobs at that time? Should supply chains have been severely damaged at that time? Should trillions in nonsense dollars have been printed and spent at that time? If the answer from the CDC is just a shrug and a whoopsie, and not a clear explanation for the obvious benefits we've all gained in exchange for what now appear to be disastrous policy decisions, well, then that same shrug and dismissal is the kindest thing we can offer the next time such a power grab is ever so much as proposed. Remember what they're now admitting. It was not their benevolence and wisdom that made this change in policy. It was you who changed their minds and forced it, just by deciding you didn't want to deal with their nonsense anymore. If there is but one positive lesson to learn from this multi-year mistake, way too late, but still better than never, it is the power of the word no. By their own admission, it is more powerful than even their own ability to save the world itself. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler. That is at ML Christensen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.